Somewhere in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., there are photographs that most Americans have never seen. Black and white images of children, some as young as 2 years old, standing on train platforms in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. They are dressed in their Sunday clothes. Some are holding small paper tags around their necks. The tags have numbers on them, not names, numbers. These children were not refugees. They were not orphans fleeing a war. They were American children, born on American soil, taken from American streets, and they were being loaded onto trains heading west and south to places they had never heard of, to live with families they had never met. And when the trains pulled away from those platforms, many of them would never return to the cities they came from. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children passed through what officials called a charitable relocation program. But a deeper look into the records, the ones that survived at least, suggests that what happened on those trains and what happened after was something far more complicated than charity. Something that the institutions behind it worked very hard to make sure future generations would not examine too closely. To understand what happened, you have to understand what American cities looked like in the second half of the 19th century. New York City in 1850 was a place of staggering contradiction. The wealthy lived in townhouses along Fifth Avenue, attended the opera, and sent their children to private academies. But 5 blocks away, in the neighborhoods of Five Points and the Lower East Side, tens of thousands of people were packed into tenement buildings so dense that sunlight rarely reached the lower floors. Immigration from Ireland, Germany, and later from Southern and Eastern Europe had swelled the city's population beyond what its infrastructure could absorb. Cholera swept through the slums in waves. Tuberculosis was so common it was simply called consumption, as if the city itself were being slowly eaten. Parents died. Fathers disappeared into factories or taverns or worse. Mothers collapsed from exhaustion and illness. And the children, there were always the children, were left to fend for themselves on the streets. By 1850, the city of New York estimated that there were over 10,000 homeless children living on its streets. 10,000 in a single city. They slept in doorways, under bridges, in the cavities of half-demolished buildings. They stole food from market stalls and picked pockets on Broadway. The newspapers called them street Arabs. The city called them a problem. A man named Charles Loring Brace called them an opportunity. Brace was a minister's son, educated at Yale, deeply influenced by the social reform movements that had taken root in New England. In 1853, he founded an organization called the Children's Aid Society. His stated mission was to rescue the children of New York slums from a life of poverty and crime. His method was radical, and it was simple. He would send them away. The first train left New York City in September of 1854. It carried 46 children. Their destination was Dowagiac, Michigan, a small farming town that had agreed to take them. When the train arrived, the children were brought to a public hall, a church, a town meeting space, or sometimes just a cleared field, and the families of the surrounding area came to look them over. This is not a metaphor. This is what the records describe. The children stood or sat at the front of the room, and the adults of the community walked among them, examining them, asking questions, selecting the ones they wanted. Children who were strong and healthy and old enough to work were chosen quickly. Very young children, or children who appeared sickly, waited longer. Some waited for hours. Some were not chosen at all. The ones who were not selected were loaded back onto the train and taken to the next town. Over the following decades, this process was repeated thousands of times. The Children's Aid Society organized what they called orphan trains, though the historical record reveals that a significant portion of the children on these trains were not, in fact, orphans. Many had at least one living parent. Some had two. They had been surrendered to the society because their families were too poor to feed them, or because a parent had been institutionalized, or because an agent of the society had visited a neighborhood and, through persuasion or pressure, had convinced a struggling mother or father that their child would have a better life somewhere else. The program grew. By the time the 1870s, the Children's Aid Society was sending out multiple trains per year. Other organizations joined the effort. The New York Foundling Hospital, run by the Sisters of Charity, ran its own version of the program, with one significant difference. The Foundling Hospital prearranged placements before the trains departed, meaning the children had already been assigned to families they would never meet until they stepped off the train. The Catholic Church had its own networks, the state had its own networks, and the trains kept moving. By the time the program finally ended in 1929, an estimated 200,000 children had been relocated. Some historians put the number higher. The exact figure is unknown because not all of the organizations involved kept consistent records, and some of the records that were kept have since disappeared. When researchers began seriously examining the orphan train program in the latter half of the 20th century, they expected to find a well-documented history of a benevolent social experiment. What they found instead was a fragmented archive full of gaps, contradictions, and questions that nobody in authority seemed eager to answer. The Children's Aid Society did maintain records, but those records were not made consistently available to the public until decades after the program ended. When researchers and descendants finally began accessing them in the 1970s and 1980s, they discovered that the documentation for individual children was often incomplete or inconsistent. Names were misspelled or changed entirely. Ages were recorded incorrectly. The identities of biological parents were frequently omitted. In some cases, children were listed under entirely different names in departure records and placement records, making it almost impossible to trace what happened to a specific child after they were placed. The Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, founded in 1986 by a woman named Mary Ellen Johnson, began collecting testimonies from elderly survivors of the program, people who had ridden the trains as children and were now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. The organization estimated that by that time there were still somewhere between 60,000 and 150,000 living descendants of orphan train riders in the United States. The range alone, a gap of nearly 100,000 people, tells you something about how uncertain the historical record truly is. What the testimony collectors found was not a uniform story of rescued children given better lives. It was something more complicated and more troubling.
Here is where the official account begins to develop its cracks. The Children's Aid Society presented its program to the public and to its donors as a system of careful placement. Brace himself wrote extensively about the process of vetting families, of following up on children after placement, of ensuring their welfare. He published annual reports filled with heartwarming letters, supposedly from placed children describing their happy new lives on farms in Indiana and Michigan and Missouri. But the follow-up system, when examined closely, was almost non-existent. Society agents visited placed children perhaps once or twice in the first year after placement. After that, contact became irregular and eventually ceased. There was no legal mechanism to compel reporting. There was no binding contract that protected the children from mistreatment. The placement was not, in most cases, an adoption in any legal sense.
The children were placed under informal arrangements, and if the family that received them decided to put them to work in the fields 12 hours a day, or to treat them as unpaid household servants, or simply to neglect them, there was no formal body empowered to intervene. A researcher examining the Society's own reports from the 1870s found that the percentage of placed children who were ever contacted again after the initial placement period was significantly lower than the Society's public statements suggested. In some regional batches, the follow-up rate was below 30%. For the remaining 70%, there is simply no record of what happened to them. In 1874, a journalist writing for a New York newspaper traveled through Indiana and Illinois specifically to investigate the condition of placed children. What he found was not uniformly bleak, but it was not the picture of rescued children thriving in wholesome farm families that the Society's literature described. He found children performing heavy agricultural labor. He found children who had been separated from siblings they had arrived with. He found children who did not know their original surnames or who had been told by their new families to stop asking about their past. His article created a brief controversy. The Society responded by calling his reporting sensationalist. The controversy faded. There is another anomaly worth noting. The program disproportionately targeted specific ethnic and religious communities. Irish Catholic children from New York were frequently placed with Protestant families in rural communities, sometimes over the explicit objection of the Catholic Church. The New York Foundling Hospital eventually established its own competing program, partly in response to this pattern, after church officials raised concerns that Catholic children placed through the Children's Aid Society were being raised in Protestant households, with their original religious identity effectively erased, along with their names and family histories. Bishop John Hughes of New York wrote to city officials in the 1850s warning that the program, whatever its intentions, was functionally serving as a mechanism for removing Catholic children from Catholic communities and absorbing them into a Protestant rural mainstream. His objections were noted. They were not acted upon.
Lee Nailing was born in New York City in 1908 and rode an orphan train to Texas at the age of 4. When researchers interviewed him in the 1980s, he was in his late 70s, and his memory of the journey was sharp in some places and blurred in others, the way all very old memories are. He remembered the noise of Grand Central Terminal. He remembered a woman in a grayed dress who walked up and down the aisle of the train car handing out sandwiches wrapped in paper. He remembered arriving in a town he could not then name, being led into a large building and standing in a line with other children while adults walked past them. He remembered being chosen by a couple who he described as quiet and not unkind. He also remembered that when he asked about his mother, who was alive, he would later learn, and had given him to the Society because she was ill and could not work, he was told not to ask that question again. He never saw his mother. He spent his adult life trying to find her and eventually found her death certificate. She had died in New York in 1918 when he was 10 years old and living in Texas, a fact that nobody had told him. A woman named Clara Comstock, who worked as a Children's Aid Society agent riding the trains in the early 20th century, kept a diary. The diary was donated to a university archive by her family after her death in the 1950s. When researchers eventually read it carefully, they found entries that did not match the official picture the Society presented publicly. Comstock wrote with evident compassion about the children she escorted, but she also wrote with notable unease about what she called the selection process, describing it in one entry as the most uncomfortable hour of any journey, though she did not elaborate further. In another entry, she noted that a placement she had supervised in Kansas had been reported as troubled, but that she had been instructed by her supervisor to mark it in the official records as satisfactory. A single diary, a single instruction, but the question it raises does not go away easily.
There is a version of this story in which the Orphan Train program was exactly what it claimed to be, an imperfect but genuinely motivated attempt to address the crisis of urban poverty and child homelessness that characterized American cities in the industrial era. In this version, Brace and his colleagues were reformers of their time, limited by the assumptions and blind spots of their era, but not malicious. Children who suffered under the program suffered because the systems meant to protect them were inadequate, not because anyone intended harm. That version is probably partly true. But there is another pattern embedded in the historical record that is harder to dismiss. The Orphan Train program operated at a moment when the United States was engaged in a large-scale project of cultural standardization. Immigration was changing the face of the country, and among the established Protestant elite, there was a documented and explicitly stated concern about what they called the foreign element in American cities. The children being sent west were overwhelmingly the children of immigrants. They were Irish, Italian, German, Jewish, Eastern European. They were Catholic and Jewish and Orthodox. And when they were placed on those trains and sent into rural Protestant communities, they were, in a very practical and documented sense, removed from those cultural communities and absorbed into a different one. This does not require a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to have designed the program with that outcome as its explicit purpose. What it requires is a willingness to look at who was doing what to whom, and to ask whether the charitable framing fully accounts for all of the effects. The sociologist Barbara Nelson, writing in the 1990s about the long history of American child welfare policy, noted that the orphan train era established a template for state and charitable intervention in poor and immigrant families that would recur throughout the 20th century, in the forced removal of Native American children to residential schools, in the mid-century foster care expansions that disproportionately affected black families, in the adoption policies that critics argued functioned as cultural erasure. She was not arguing that these were all the same program. She was arguing that they shared a logic and that the logic was worth examining. The Orphan Train program ended in 1929. It ended partly because new state laws governing child welfare made its informal placement system legally untenable, and partly because the progressive era had produced a new set of ideas about keeping families together rather than dispersing them. The organizations that had run the trains pivoted. They became modern adoption agencies, family service bureaus, foster care administrators. Some of them still exist today, under different names, in different forms. The records they kept during the Orphan Train era are held in archives across the country, in New York, in Missouri, in Texas, in Michigan. They are not all accessible. Some collections remain closed to researchers. Some have been transferred to institutions that have been reluctant to allow examination. The reasons given for these restrictions are administrative. They are always administrative.
Somewhere in the United States tonight, there is a person in their 60s or 70s who knows or suspects that their grandmother or great-grandfather arrived in their town on a train, stood in a building while strangers looked them over, and was taken home by a family whose name they were eventually made to carry. Some of these people have spent years trying to reconstruct what was lost. Some have found fragments. Some have found nothing at all. The children on those trains did not ask to be part of a social experiment. They did not ask to be numbered instead of named. They did not ask for the records of their origins to be kept in archives that their own descendants would struggle to access more than a century later. We are told that the Orphan Train program was a product of its time, that the people who ran it meant well, that the alternative for many of these children would have been worse. Perhaps all of that is true. History is rarely simple, and the impulse toward charity is rarely entirely without worth. But we might also ask why it took until the 1980s for serious historical attention to turn to a program that had moved 200,000 children across a continent. We might ask why the records are incomplete.
We might ask why the children who experienced it were, for so many decades, asked to be grateful rather than to be heard. We might ask whose interests were served by framing an act of institutional power as an act of pure generosity. The photographs in the archives show children standing on platforms with numbers around their necks. Someone chose to number them instead of naming them. Someone made that decision and wrote it into procedure, and the trains ran for 75 years. Maybe it was simply an administrative convenience. Maybe the people who designed the system never paused to think about what it meant to reduce a child to a number on a tag. Maybe that kind of thoughtlessness is its own answer. Or maybe the question is not whether they thought about it. Maybe the question is whether we will.